Imagine lying in bed at night and hearing footsteps directly above you, in your attic. You investigate. There's nothing there. But the next night, you hear them again. And again. For the Gruber family living on a remote Bavarian farm in 1922, these weren't just creepy sounds. They were a warning they didn't heed. Because just days later, all 6 members of this household would be brutally murdered with a mattock, a farming tool similar to a pickaxe. Their bodies wouldn't be discovered for days. And when investigators arrived, they found something that still sends chills down the spines of criminologists over a century later. The killer had stayed in the house after the murders for days. This is the story of Germany's most disturbing unsolved mystery. And today, we're diving deep into every chilling detail. Let's set the scene. It's March 1922, and we're in a tiny hamlet called Hinterkaifeck, about 70 kilometers north of Munich in Bavaria, Germany. The name Hinterkaifeck literally means behind Kaifeck. It was so remote it barely qualified as a settlement. We're talking about a single farmstead, completely isolated, surrounded by dark forests. The nearest neighbors were far enough away that screams wouldn't carry. Living on this farm was the Gruber family. The patriarch was 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, a stern, somewhat difficult man by all accounts. With him was his wife, 72-year-old Kazilia. Also living on the farm was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, age 35. Her husband had died in World War I, or so everyone thought. We'll come back to that detail because it's important. Victoria had 2 children, 7-year-old Kazilia, named after her grandmother, and 2-year-old Joseph. And finally, there was the maid. This detail is crucial. The previous maid had quit 6 months earlier, claiming the farmhouse was haunted. She reported hearing strange noises, footsteps, and voices when no one else should have been there. She refused to stay another night. The new maid, 44-year-old Maria Baumgartner, had just arrived on March 31st, 1922. It would be her first and last day at Hinterkaifeck. In the days leading up to the murders, Andreas Gruber noticed several deeply disturbing things. And here's where this case transforms from a tragic crime into something far more sinister. About 6 months earlier, around the same time the previous maid quit, Andreas discovered a set of footprints in the snow. They led from the forest edge to his farmhouse. But here's what made them terrifying. There were no footprints leading back. Whoever made those tracks had entered his property and never left. At least not through the snow. Then Andreas heard the footsteps, night after night, coming from the attic above the bedrooms. He investigated multiple times. Nothing. No one. But the sounds continued. He found a strange newspaper on his property. One he didn't subscribe to and hadn't purchased. How did it get there? Who brought it? Days before the murders, Andreas noticed that one of his house keys had gone missing. Just vanished. And perhaps most chilling of all, Andreas heard voices. Unclear conversations coming from the attic space, though when he checked, he was absolutely alone. Andreas mentioned these incidents to neighbors during his last visit to town. But he didn't seem overly concerned, more puzzled than frightened. This was his fatal mistake. He never reported any of this to the police. In rural 1920s Bavaria, you handled your own affairs. You didn't run to authorities over strange noises. Andreas Gruber would never make it back to town. The exact timeline of the murders has been pieced together through forensic evidence and the lack of certain activities at the farm. Here's what investigators believe happened. On March 31st, 1922, likely in the early evening around dusk, Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, his daughter Victoria, and his granddaughter, 7-year-old Kazilia, went to the barn to feed the animals or complete evening chores. They never made it back to the house. The killer was waiting. One by one, they were struck down with a mattock, a heavy farming tool with a blade on one end and a pick on the other. The attacks were savage, brutal. Andreas Gruber's skull was shattered with such force that pieces of bone were driven into his brain. But here's what makes this particularly horrific. Little Kazilia survived the initial attack. The autopsy would later reveal that she had torn out clumps of her own hair in her death agony, lying in the blood-soaked straw of the barn, slowly dying over several hours. After killing 4 family members in the barn, the killer calmly walked across the yard to the farmhouse. Inside, Maria Baumgartner, the maid who had arrived just that day, and 2-year-old Joseph were still alive. The killer murdered them both in their beds. Maria was struck so hard that her skull split open. Little Joseph, just a toddler, was killed in his crib. 6 people, an entire household, slaughtered in their home and barn. And then, the killer did something that defies all normal criminal behavior. He stayed. This is where the Hinterkaifeck case becomes truly unique in the annals of criminal history. After committing 6 murders, the killer didn't flee. Instead, he made himself at home. Over the next several days, investigators estimate at least 3, possibly 4 days, the killer lived in the Gruber farmhouse. Evidence shows that he fed the family's livestock. The animals were all alive and healthy when police arrived, which means someone was caring for them. Smoke was seen rising from the chimney on multiple occasions after March 31st. Neighbors noticed but assumed the family was simply going about their business. Someone ate food from the kitchen. Meals were prepared. Dishes were used. The killer moved freely through a house that contained 6 corpses. He slept there, ate there, possibly even read that mysterious newspaper by lamplight while the bodies of his victims lay just yards away, growing cold. Why? What kind of person murders an entire family and then stays for breakfast? Psychologists and criminal profilers have puzzled over this for decades. The behavior suggests someone who felt comfortable in the space, someone who had no pressing need to flee, and someone with an absolutely chilling level of emotional detachment. Eventually, the killer simply left, walked away into history, never to be identified. On April 4, 1922, 4 days after the murders, neighbors finally became concerned. Little Kazilia hadn't shown up for school since Friday. The mail was piling up, uncollected. Most tellingly, none of the Grubers had been seen in town, which was unusual. Several neighbors decided to investigate. They approached the eerily quiet farmhouse with growing dread. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They discovered the 4 bodies in the barn first: Andreas, Kazilia Sr., Victoria, and young Kazilia, all covered in straw in a crude attempt to conceal them. The amount of blood was staggering. Then they entered the house and found Maria and baby Joseph, murdered in their beds. The police were summoned immediately, and what followed was one of the most extensive investigations in German criminal history at that time. Over 100 suspects were interviewed. More than 100 people. Friends, neighbors, traveling workers, known criminals, recently released prisoners. Everyone within a wide radius became a person of interest. The police brought in clairvoyants, yes, actual psychics, in a desperate attempt to solve the case. Obviously, this led nowhere. The bodies were exhumed and decapitated so the heads could be sent to Munich for a groundbreaking forensic technique: facial reconstruction and skull examination. The heads were never returned to the families and were lost during World War II, adding another layer of tragedy to this case. Despite all these efforts, no arrest was ever made. No charges were ever filed. The case went cold, and it has remained cold for over 100 years. Over the decades, numerous theories have emerged about who killed the Gruber family and why. Let's examine the most compelling suspects. Theory 1. Victoria's dead husband. Remember how I mentioned Victoria's husband supposedly died in World War I? Well, it gets complicated. Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, was reported killed in action, but his body was never positively identified. Some researchers believe Karl may have survived, returned to find his wife living with another man. There were rumors of an affair or a relationship with a farm worker, and slaughtered the family in a jealous rage. This would explain someone who knew the farm layout, someone who might have been hiding in the attic, and someone who felt entitled to stay in his house after the murders. However, there's no concrete evidence Karl survived the war, and his military records indicate death in combat. Theory 2. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. This is perhaps the most discussed suspect. Lorenz Schlittenbauer was a neighbor and local farmer who had a documented romantic relationship with Victoria Gabriel. Many believed Schlittenbauer was the father of 2-year-old Joseph. If Andreas Gruber discovered this and threatened to expose the affair or demand financial support, it could provide motive. Even more suspicious, Schlittenbauer was part of the group that discovered the bodies. Witnesses claimed he behaved strangely, was unusually calm, and even handled the murder weapon with his bare hands, potentially contaminating evidence. He was questioned multiple times but never charged. Some investigators believed he was the killer but couldn't prove it. Theory 3. The drifter/stranger. Some theories propose a random drifter or homeless person took shelter in the Gruber barn or attic, was discovered, and killed the family to protect his hiding spot or during a robbery gone wrong. The staying behind behavior could indicate someone with no home to return to, someone who saw an opportunity for shelter and food. However, this doesn't explain the missing key or the newspaper that appeared weeks before the murders, suggesting advanced planning. Theory 4. Financial motive. Andreas Gruber was known to be relatively wealthy for a farmer. He kept cash on the property. Some suspect a robbery motive, though no significant money was reported missing. Could someone have tortured Andreas for the location of his money, then killed all witnesses? The truth? We'll likely never know. The case is simply too old, the evidence too degraded, and all the principals long dead. What we do know is that someone with knowledge of the farm, the family's routines, and possibly a personal grudge, murdered 6 people and showed absolutely no remorse. No panic, no rush to flee. Just cold, calculated brutality followed by chilling domesticity. The Hinterkaifeck murders left an indelible mark on German criminal history and popular culture. The farmhouse was torn down in 1923. No one would live there after what happened. The land was eventually sold, and today, a small memorial marks the approximate location of where the farmstead once stood. The case files remained open for decades, though active investigation ceased by the 1950s. Modern cold case investigators have periodically revisited the evidence, but with no DNA technology available from 1922 crime scenes and all physical evidence long gone, new breakthroughs are nearly impossible. In 2007, students from the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy conducted a cold case review as a training exercise. They developed a profile of the likely killer and examined all the historical evidence. Their conclusion? Lorenz Schlittenbauer remained the most likely suspect, but the evidence was too circumstantial to have ever secured a conviction, even in 1922. The case has inspired numerous books, documentaries, films, and even a German television series. It remains one of the most discussed unsolved murders in European history. Why does a century-old murder case still capture our imagination? I think it's because Hinterkaifeck represents our deepest fears made real. The fear that someone is in your home, watching, waiting, and you don't know it. The fear that danger can find you even in the most remote, safe locations. The fear that evil can be both brutal and casual. Someone who kills 6 people and then calmly feeds the chickens. And perhaps most disturbing, the fear that some crimes are simply unsolvable. That justice isn't always served. That sometimes the bad guy gets away. The Gruber family's last moments must have been absolutely terrifying. Did they know who was killing them? Did Andreas recognize his attacker? Did little Kazilia call out for help that never came? We'll never have answers. But we can remember them. We can tell their story. And we can acknowledge that what happened on that isolated Bavarian farm in March 1922 was one of the most disturbing crimes in modern history. The Hinterkaifeck case remains officially unsolved. Unless new evidence emerges, which seems extraordinarily unlikely after 103 years, we'll never know who killed the Gruber family or why. What do you think happened? Do you believe it was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Victoria's supposedly dead husband, a random drifter, or something else entirely? Let me know your theories in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into one of history's darkest mysteries compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime content. We cover cases from the famous to the forgotten, always with respect for the victims and rigorous research. There are dozens of other unsolved cases just as chilling as Hinterkaifeck. Should I cover more? Let me know. Thank you for watching, and remember, lock your doors, check your attic, and stay safe out there.